This is Teaching for Student Success. I'm Stephen Robineau. Episode transcriptions will now become standard thanks to a partnership with Trent. Trent, transcribing audio and video to text. Learn more at trent.com. TRINT.com. At the end of every academic period, semester, quarter, or other, the approximately 1.5 million faculty in higher education around the country assign grades. For most of us, there is at least a little bit of struggle in this process. For others, it can be very stressful. And for our students, it is a very stressful time and often a very frustrating process. The grading system most of us use has been around since the early 1900s. Its inception was even earlier. Some might argue it ain't broke, so don't fix it. But it is broke. And at a minimum, the current grading system is certainly problematic. One of the biggest problems is that grades, as they are generally implemented around the country, demotivate learning. Demotivating students can't be good if we really want them to learn, if we want them to persist, and if we want them to love the discipline as much as we do. A small number of colleges and universities don't assign grades, but for now, most of us are required to assign grades at the end of every course. Today, we are going to talk with Dr. Robert Talbert and Dr. David Clark, two faculty members who are working to change the way grades are assigned, really working to be thoughtful and deliberate to ensure, as best they can, that grades reflect student learning and growth in their courses. Dr. Robert Talbert is a professor of mathematics and presidential fellow for the advancement of learning at Grand Valley State University in Allendale, Michigan. In this role, he coordinates initiatives to expand innovations in teaching and learning, including the expansion of active learning spaces and communities of practice around active learning and alternative grading. Robert is the author of Flipped Learning, a guide for higher education faculty, published in 2017, and is currently finishing a second book, Grading for Growth, co-authored with Professor David Clark, which will be published in 2023, this year. Dr. David Clark is an associate professor in the Department of Mathematics at Grand Valley State University. David is a leading proponent of alternative grading in higher education. David and Robert also collaborate on a blog, Grading for Growth. I'm very excited to welcome Dr. David Clark and Dr. Robert Talbert. Thank you for joining us on Teaching for Student Success.
Thank you, Steve, for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm excited. I've invited you both here today to discuss some of your favorite and some of my favorite articles on your blog, Grading for Growth. So I actually had a question. I didn't know. Is the blog the larger thing? Is each posting what do you call a posting in a blog?
An article, a blog post, a passing thought.
Whatever we were thinking about that week.
I think the blog is the collective term and the article is the individual thing.
Article and blog, sure. Okay. But first, let's begin by talking about the many challenges of grading. What is wrong with how most faculty are grading today, or at least what are some of the problems? Then let's talk about some of your favorite options, alternatives. We might focus on the connection or disconnection between learning and grading. I don't know who would like to start. I'll leave that up to you two.
There's a bunch of problems with grading, and whether it connects to learning or not is a big one. There's this useful framing, I think, of sort of false negatives and false positives that you can think about with learning. I'm sure everyone listening who has ever taught a class has had the experience of a student who starts out and has a ton of trouble and they just totally tank an exam, and then that bad grade is permanently averaged in, even if they later on figure it out. And maybe you have a comprehensive final and they really get it and they show you they've understood all these ideas. But we're averaging in that 0 or whatever, and so they're mathematically eliminated from a good grade. So we could call that like a false negative, right? It's incorrectly showing a low grade that they actually had high learning for. And then there's a flip side. There's false positives. So partial credit, earning points for things like just attending class or doing extra credit or things like this. It can all add up, and all those points count in exactly the same way as points that represent actually learning something. And so we've, I'm sure, all seen students who sort of get by, right? And they pass a class on partial credit without ever fully doing a problem correctly. And so basically the way we do averaging and points and partial credit doesn't really connect to what students have learned. It's just this mishmash, this mathematical mishmash of ideas.
Robert, would you like to add anything?
David laid this out really well. And another way to think about the false negative, false positive thing is when we collect grades, we're trying to make an inference about learning. So this is kind of almost a statistical question. And thinking about statistics like Nielsen ratings and so forth, gather all this partial data, this discrete data, to try to make an inference about something that happened in a broader sense. And that's what we're doing when we grade. We're gathering all this information and trying to decide whether or not our students learned anything as a result of our interventions. And the fact is that the way that we traditionally do grading with points in very isolated, discrete moments in time is just not very good data. I mean, it leads to, in stats, we call it like type 1 error and type 2 error. It is just another word for false positives and false negatives. And can you make an inference about what a student has learned based on 3 tests and a final exam? The answer is no. You really cannot infer much of anything. Even if all those scores are zeros, there's probably a reason for those zeros, and it's not laziness. Okay, so maybe the student is really learning things, but they're on a time delay. They just take longer than other people do, or they're poor test takers. We're not really testing what they know. We're testing how well they can express what they know. And there's all kinds of questions about the quality and the validity of the data that we get from grades. And these questions have no resolutions to them. I think the only choice at this point is to reconsider the whole thing, all of it.
Okay, that's a big problem. We're not going to be able to address all of it today, but you both are taking it, I would think, a chunk at a time at how to move forward, because you still have to find ways to assign grades. So you haven't blown up the whole system at Grand Valley State yet, I don't think, have you?
Yet.
Yet. Yeah, is the operative word. Okay. All right. Well, that's good. Well, okay. So that lays out the problem pretty nicely. One of the things I like about your blog is you recently posted your New Year resolutions, which we'll get to in a while. But why don't we start with some of the history of grading? I mean, how did we get to this point? Robert, you wrote a nice piece entitled "Who is Horace Mann?" published in December of 2022. I thought we would start with that.
Sure. The history of grading is a lot more interesting than it sounds when you say the history of grading. It's actually, when I mention this to students, like, hey, have you ever wondered where the 4.0 GPA came from? They were like, wow, it came from somewhere. I just thought it was sort of hard coded into education itself. But in fact, up until, like you said, maybe about 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the current system of grading we have now with points and GPAs and letters and so forth would have been completely unrecognizable to most universities. It did not evolve until the Industrial Revolution came around. One of the key figures leading up to that was a gentleman by the name of Horace Mann, an educational reformer from the mid-19th century who had his heart in the right place. But he wanted to help students and parents learn to manage themselves better, and was wondering how we might improve upon a very disjointed and incongruous system, if you can call it that, of education that had sort of landed in the United States during the colonial period, copied from universities in Europe and sort of scaled down. It wasn't great what we used to have back in the early 1800s. There were many cultural and social changes taking place during the 1800s, westward expansion, migration to cities, and students would no longer spend their entire school careers in the same one-room schoolhouse anymore. And there was a need for a system for communicating between educational systems about a single student. So before, say, 1850, a student could have a certain academic record in one school that used a completely homegrown system that had some bizarre features to it, like punctuality or this person is a good citizen. It's like nobody even knew what this stuff meant. And if they picked up and moved to another school system 50 miles away, it would be a completely different way of conceiving of their academic progress. There was just no way to connect a student from one school system to another, nor was there a need to. But with all these changes happening in the middle of the 19th century, there was a need to revamp things. And Horace Mann was was a reformer who was very interested in this. He was said to have gone to every school building in Massachusetts at the time, where he was a politician, a leader, and visited the school grounds of every school just to kind of check out what was going on. And he did a fact-finding tour in Europe and landed in Prussia, which at that time was in some ways like the most advanced country in the world in sort of an organizational sense. Prussia was in the middle of revamping their army to move it from a very regimented command and control kind of structure to one where the soldiers in the field would be able to make their own decisions on the battlefield and move quickly in a kind of a distributed sort of way. To have that kind of soldier, you needed a better education system. And so they were creating an education system to produce the next generation of Prussian army soldiers. It sounds like this is not going in a good direction, but it actually works out pretty well. And Horace Mann saw this and thought, that's what the United States needs, and brought it back. And that's, in many ways, this is where we got our educational system today. He invented the report card. The report card was a way of, again, perfectly good intentions here. The report card was a way to communicate to parents exactly what their kids are doing in school. I mean, that's a good thing, right? But to have a report card, you got to have something put on the report card. And that's kind of where the notion of a quasi-standardized system of evaluating students began to evolve. Now, it really found its footing near the turn of the 20th century in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. The notion of grades was stolen from agriculture. You've heard of grade A beef or grade A grain and so forth. And I guess someone must have thought, hey, if we can standardize and measure and systematize cows, we can do it with students too, can't we? And that's sort of what happened. That's why we call it a grade. And where we got A, B, C, D, E was directly a result of how it had been implemented in the agricultural industry. The system was birthed by a real need to have a more dependable system to follow students where they go. Okay. And I think today we really need that, because if a student might at any given point in college in 2023 be taking courses at possibly 3 or 4 different colleges, or even not in a college, using some sort of credentialing system. And so having something where schools can talk to each other is important, but it also led to a system where students kind of faded into the background. They were more objectified and thought of as just objects in a classroom. And unfortunately, that's where much of our grading system ends up today. It does not focus on student growth. It does not take students into account as human beings. This is just a system that has played itself out. And in this day and age, I think we need something different.
Wow. So you just gave me that vision of students being stamped grade A, grade B, grade C.
Or branded with a cow brand or something that's maybe more appropriate given the context.
Exactly. That's a good one. But it's a horrible image. David, please.
And I actually want to interject one particular thing that I think is important to think about in there. At the same time period Robert's talking about, so sort of turn of the 20th century, Industrial Revolution, Taylorism, and looking at, measuring the efficiency and output of places. This is where the idea of students following a normal distribution comes from, that skill and knowledge and some sort of inherent idea of ability should be distributed normally, and that it also should be distributed normally when they come out of a class, having learned things. And that's an idea that's gotten really deeply embedded. They're like, oh, of course, we should have a bell curve for all these measurable educational things, which I think is very much false. And we've known is false for about as long as we've thought it was true. But it enables some of the worst parts of grading.
Right. And we see that all the time. If you look at people's grades, you see that all the time. We'll talk about some grading methods where that's not necessary, I think, soon. So students are accustomed to this grading system, right? They've been brought up to it. So we're talking about higher ed. So they've been in it for 12 plus years. Everyone understands it, whether they like it or not. And changing how a student is graded in a course must be unsettling to students. Once you start to offer them an alternative grading system, it's like, wait a second, I know the old system. I might not like it, but I understand it. You're offering me something else. David, in August of 2022, you wrote about building trust with students and trying to reassure them that you have their best interests at heart. I thought we would talk about that a little bit. How do you get students to buy into a new system?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is really important, right? We need to convince students that if we're doing something really different with grades that feels unfamiliar, that we have their best interest at heart. And we know what we're doing, and we're doing it for a good reason that is based on them and their learning. So yeah, these are pretty critical things. And also, an instructor who changes their grading system knows what they're doing better than anybody else. And as with a lot of things, when you've learned it really well, you can lose track of what it was like to try to figure it out initially, which is exactly what our students are doing in our classes when they come in that first day and they're like, what is this thing? What's going on here? So yeah, the key, I think, to helping alternative grading work and introduce it and to build trust with students is to communicate really clearly, to communicate with students what you're doing, why you're doing it, and to do that over time and in a bunch of different ways. So we have a syllabus. So the syllabus should communicate what you're doing really clearly. First day of class, why am I teaching in this, or why am I grading in this unusual way? And how is that a benefit for students, right? Why is that good for students? Things I usually say are things like, I want my grading to represent what you really know, even if you have to struggle, just like humans always do when they're learning. Messages like that are really important to communicate. And at the same time, realizing that just like anything else, a new grading system is something that students are learning. And so learning takes time, and it's going to involve errors, and it's not something that you can necessarily absorb all in one go. And so I'm not going to be able to go in on the first day of class and just say, here's how it works, and then everyone gets it, and okay, we're all set. If you do that, that's a way to not build trust, because students think you're just going to splat everything at them in that way, and they're not going to be able to learn. So introduce ideas when they're appropriate. Okay, here's how grading works on an exam just before the exam. Okay, now I've handed the exam back. Here's a reminder about how grading worked on that exam. We're getting near the end of the semester, and everyone's trying to remember, how is it I know if I'm getting an A or a B? Let's talk again about how that works. And weaving things in throughout the semester along with those positive messages, the reinforcement of, I am thinking about you and your success, and that's why I'm using this unfamiliar system. It is one of those things that involves a lot of little elements over time, not a magic wand that can just change things.
Thank you. And just to tie it in with what we were just talking about, I assume one of the elements that is discussed with students early on is the notion that no one has to fail this course. There doesn't have to be a normal distribution. You're not imposing a curve on anything.
Absolutely. And that's that exact message, that I believe everyone in this course can succeed, and you can all earn an A if you want to. And that I really mean that is something I repeat a lot. And I think for that message to succeed, you have to truly believe it. And if you do, you can communicate that to students. And it's a weird idea. Also communicating to colleagues, right? There can be this sense of, well, your average is too high, or too many students are earning A's. And that's, it's important to open that conversation with students and with colleagues about, what does an A mean? What does a grade mean? And if we really believe it's connected to learning, that changes your mind about what matters in terms of averages or distributions.
Interesting. Okay, there's other things I'm going to make notes about to talk about, but Robert, is there something you'd like to add?
I would just really double down on what David said about building trust. One of the best ways to build trust is simplicity. I mean, if you use plain language, simple structures, that's easy to trust. But when you look at a syllabus and it looks like the inside of a F-16 or something, it's like incredibly complicated, then that automatically mitigates the trust you see. So I think one of the things that David and I really hammer home in our blog posts and in the book especially is just the value of simplicity in a grading system, like real simplicity. I mean, Stephen, you said a while ago that students understand traditional grading, but I'm not so sure that anybody understands traditional grading. I mean, it's a false sense of simplicity that you get from traditional grading. You look up the grading table in the syllabus, and it says final exam 50%, 2 midterm exams 25% each. And that looks really simple until you start thinking about it. Like, how do these 25 percentage points come to be, on this midterm exam? Well, there are problems, and each of those is worth 12 points or something like that. So, why 12? Why not 20 or 5 or 1 instead? And how would I get an 8 out of 12? I mean, how do you decide? There's all these hidden complexities that take place in traditional grading that, to me, just render the whole thing completely untrustworthy. when I speak with my students about traditional grading and alternative methods, it's like the first time they've ever been given permission to think critically about grading systems. And once they start doing it, they realize, wow, this doesn't make any sense. Another thing that's useful to get students to come on board with what we're doing is just to simply don't talk about grades. Let's just talk about learning. I mean, how do people learn anything? I asked my students this on the first day of class. I tell them it's the only icebreaker that I like. I ask them, tell me something that you're good at doing and tell me how you got that way. And get into groups and talk about the thing you're good at and how you got that way. And then I ask them to share. And every time I do this, semester after semester, the things they bring up about how they get good at something they really, truly enjoy doing, it comes down to practice, time, having good people around you and getting good feedback, failure, the ability to learn from your failures and things like that. Nobody ever talks about points or lecturing or any of the stuff that we feel like is like part of the DNA of higher ed itself. And so I just tell students, like, what you are about to read in the syllabus is exactly what you just told me about how you got good at your favorite things. That's why it's in the syllabus. I found, like, from there, as long as I keep the details simple, I don't have to get buy-in. I mean, it's just like, well, of course, this is how it should be.
David, yeah.
There's something I want to add about, what's sort of hanging around what Robert's talking about there is it's really important if you want students to trust you to begin by trusting your students as well. And I love this phrase, begin by trusting students. This is a Jesse Stommel thing. He's one of the leaders in talking about ungrading as a particular thing. But I think it's a great philosophy, no matter if we're talking about grading or anything else in class. And it just means begin with the mindset that, your students are real people and they're trying to do their best and they are generally trustworthy. Conversely, don't begin by assuming that whatever a student's doing, they're trying to get away with something. And if you sort of begin with that view on things, it changes how you construct your syllabus. It changes how you talk about your grades and your reasons for choosing things in class. It changes about what you decide to include and not include. And it really does make a difference. And students pick up on it. They really see that you're a person who trusts them and that you should be deserving of trust as well.
I like that. I like that a lot. So once students buy into your system, or maybe it doesn't take much buy-in because maybe the way you approach it, they understand it and it makes a lot of sense. What happens to them in other classes that grade traditionally? Have you sown the seeds of dissatisfaction? Do your students express dissatisfaction to other faculty? Robert's shaking his head yes.
Yes, we have.
Do other faculty become unhappy with you? What's going on?
Well, if they're unhappy with us, we haven't gotten it to our faces, so I'll take that. But what I have found is sort of the flip side. I mean, there's a great deal of interest in kind of knowing what exactly is going on here with all this stuff. I teach a number of math courses that are really service courses for our computer science department. Computer science is a perfect place to do alternative grading because the whole notion of computing is based on iteration and repetition. And so the students talk to their advisors about this, and a number of computer science faculty are now carrying the torch and doing some really innovative things around our place because they kind of get it too. And it's like, well, I really hate giving an 8 out of 12 on a Python program. It should be like, keep writing this program until there's no bugs in it, and then you can get a 12 out of 12 or no 12s, just like it's good enough.
Right.
And so there might be some questions, I think. I'm sure there are questions, going around. I'm teaching some engineering classes right now, and I know that the engineers in my school might be wondering what the heck is going on in my classes. But I also know that any question they've got, I can back it up with students' work because I trust my students to be giving me work that is really and truly done right. And that's what everybody wants.
Absolutely.
I'll confirm that alternative grading has really spread quickly throughout our department here, the math department, because I think a lot of our colleagues have seen that there's a lot of benefit from it. Students are enthusiastic about it, and that they learn, that they really do get something good out of it. So there's been, I'd say, more interest than pushback, at least in our context. We work at a really pretty good place as far as doing interesting teaching.
Nice. So I want to suggest something. There's some data I want to see because I've seen data from calculus courses, failure rates of lots of different faculty who have taught hundreds of students. So one nice thing is your calculus teaching faculty will have if they've taught there for a long time, the N becomes pretty good. It's not 10 students or 12 students, it's hundreds of students. And I've seen data that at one particular institution that has some faculty have very high failure rates. Some faculty have very low failure rates. And some faculty have failure rates that are typical for the university. How do those students do in the next class? The one in the middle, their students do the best. Being easy or being hard in grading doesn't help the students. So I'd be super interested to see in your situation with alternative grading and a sequence of courses, how grading works and what it looks like and compares to the current traditional system that is massively problematic when you look at those data. Any thoughts about that?
There is some data. So there's most of the things that we have, small N studies are, instructors following up their students in a subsequent class that they teach or something like that. But the studies we have tend to show either, so if what we're measuring is like final grade in one class and final grade in the other, and comparing students from an alternatively graded class versus not going into the second class, that the students from the alternatively graded classes tend to do either same average or slightly better. So it's usually like a 1/3 step, a B to a B plus kind of thing. So not worse, perhaps a little better. And what I find best about that is it's not like we're being easy. If students are doing better in the first class, the prerequisite class, it's not because we're being easy. We're actually holding them to a really high standard. And so they're not being hurt in the follow-up classes, even if the follow-up class is a traditionally graded class. There's a bit of evidence that I've seen recently from chemistry, not from math, that shows about the same effect in a pretty large N intro chemistry to general chemistry class as well. So not worse, slightly better, if anything.
Interesting. I think I would love to see papers on this. I think this is a great area to work on now. And this sort of brings me back to the motivation question that you talking about grades as demotivators, right? You talk about how do your students learn? How do they become proficient at something that they love, whatever it is, right? They're never being graded there, right? And so we have this dilemma that we have to assign, at least it would appear that we have to assign grades. That may or may not even be true. And grades demotivate. So how does the alternative grading paradigm minimize that problem? Because you are still giving grades. Do you find your students are more motivated when you use an alternative grading format?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the central thing in it is that a grade on an assignment in an alternatively graded class is not the final word. It's not saying, here it is, I'm judging you, this is how you did, the exam is going to count in your grade forever. It's just the first step in a feedback loop, right? It's the first step in potentially being able to learn more and then go back and demonstrate that on another assessment, get a different grade, and that there's no penalty for needing a little bit of time to go and learn it better, and that whatever they have learned in the end is the only thing that counts. And so this is definitely more motivational because students don't feel like they're just cut out of that learning process entirely. They can come back and it's worth studying something again. It's worth going back to what they didn't do first. So even though there are grades involved still and there is some level of judgment, they know it's not final, and that's a really big deal.
Robert?
Right. I just want to chip in on that. If we're going to talk about motivation, let's go back to the psychological theory of motivation. I think it was the best expression of which is self-determination theory through the work of DC and Ryan. And they put out three main pillars for motivation in self-determination theory: autonomy, competence, and connection. Autonomy meaning you can be motivated because you believe you're really good at something, like you yourself are good at it. Competency meaning that you are good in the first place, and autonomy is like you got good because of your own efforts. And connectedness meaning that you're not doing it in a vacuum. You're doing the ideas that you're working on are connected to larger things that you're interested in, and you yourself are connected to other people doing the same thing. And when we talk about any form of alternative grading, whether it's ungrading, there's a whole panoply of a whole zoo of of systems like specifications grading and contract grading and standards-based grading we talk about in our book and on the blog, they're all based on feedback loops. Ultimately, it comes back to you do something, you give it a try, and you get some feedback, and then that information feeds back into another try, and you keep doing this iteration until it is quote unquote good enough. And so that allows you to build your competence. It allows you to clearly see your own efforts in the loop process, and it connects you with other human beings who are giving you the feedback. So, I mean, all the ingredients for intrinsic motivation, which is the term that we get from self-determination theory, are there in any form of alternative grading you choose. And on the flip side of that, traditional grading is highly demotivating, or the best we can hope for is that it creates extrinsic motivation. Like a student comes to class because they want a good grade and they don't give a crap about calculus or whatever the case may be. That's about as good as we can hope for in a traditionally graded course, because we're deliberately cutting off all the tributary experiences that lead to intrinsic motivation when we do traditional grading. It's just not built into the system. It could happen maybe, but it's certainly not the default. And you've got to really work hard to make a traditionally graded subject intrinsically motivating, like harder than most of us have the capability of doing, unless we're genius teachers like David.
Hey, wait, what? Oh, sorry. Okay.
I got a little plug to my co-author there.
All right, interesting. Let's move to equity for a minute. Are alternative grading systems more equitable than traditional grading systems? You wrote about this, David. So, Robert, I'm sorry I picked a couple of David's posts here.
Oh, David knows everything about this. He's the right person to ask here.
Now let's talk about equity, because I think that's that's certainly a critical hallmark today.
So, yeah, this is, got to handle this with some subtlety here. So the following is not true. If you plop in a box of alternative grading on top of your class and say, all right, I'm doing this now, look, it's more equitable. That's not necessarily true, right? It isn't this automatic thing you can sort of plug in. But what is true is that the things that make alternative grading work well also support better equity for a lot of the same reasons. For example, one of the key things, what we call them our 4 pillars of alternative grading. One of the key ones is that you have clear standards, right? What is it that you care about in terms of content? And that directly feeds into what you assess. And there's never a question about what it is you're studying, what it is you're assessing, how it connects to what matters in your class. If that's something that you do, because that's part of alternative grading, then that also helps support greater equity in your class, because it makes you think really carefully about what is it that matters and how am I assessing it. And one of the things you discover pretty quickly is that things that are really bias prone, like assessing attendance or participation or giving extra credit or doing things that reflect more about how a student was raised or where they were raised, what sort of household they came from and how much their parents earned, that those things are often assessed in a traditional class, but they're not directly connected to learning. And so when you spell out, these are the things that I want you to have learned and I'm going to assess directly on them, you cut a lot of those more bias-prone items out. So you can see what I mean by they're sort of feeding, it's two things feeding simultaneously into greater equity in a class, but it's not automatic. I can decide I still want to grade on participation in an alternatively graded class. And if I just do that and I never teach students about that and we never have a chance to practice, and if I just record it with no chances to revise or improve, then that's not going to support better equity. But if I keep that same sort of ethos there of I have clear content standards, we're going to practice with them, and there are chances to try again and improve without penalty, then that does help support greater equity.
Okay. So I just want to take a minute to clarify why some of these things might be inequitable. I mean, you mentioned them, but I just want to dig a little deeper. So, for example, participation. Participation might mean something specific to you, and students may not know what that means. And there may be cultural barriers that make it difficult for students to participate in the way that you want, that you've decided participation looks like. Is that right?
Absolutely. So if I decide I'm going to record if I think you are participating, then that's filtered through my implicit expectations about what participation looks like, which are culturally affected things. It's things affected through, me being an academic for a huge portion of my life. And it's also filtered the opposite way through what is it I can observe about my students and what are they doing that I fail to observe that might really matter. And so if it's all feeding through me and my expectations and my implicit beliefs about participation, then that's a very bias-prone thing.
And same thing like attendance or extra credit, because you have students who have very different lives from each other. So you have students who may have multiple jobs, they may have families, they may do elder care. You don't know. It's likely that one doesn't know these things about a lot of their students. So if you give opportunities and they don't have time, then there's a bias against them.
And I do want to add, there are ways to handle a lot of these things. So a lot of instructors want to value participation in some way, for example, or engagement. And there's absolutely ways to do this. But the key to them is they need to involve the students, right? So students actually being able to tell you what participation looks like, to make sure that you're not missing out on something important. And so there are ways to include these things that are much more equitable, and they may or may not even involve an alternative grading system. But alternative grading tends to be much more amenable to making that sort of thing happen.
Great. We're talking about this issue of personal biases and how that impacts evaluations of students. And the term you use is bias resistance. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Bias resistance, I guess we've mentioned some of it, extra credit, curves, late work, and unconscious biases. So let's just take another minute to talk about how you ensure that or do your best to minimize your biases. And how do you see the things you haven't seen before?
Yeah, I think you put it well there, right? Do your best. I mean, the thing about implicit biases is they are implicit, right? And so I think the most important thing I can say there is to be on the lookout for places where you are exerting judgment about what it is that matters or not. And of course, we exert judgment about this is an academic topic, right? I've chosen the topics for the class or the standards for the class. But when I'm exerting judgment that can be clouded through my own personal experience and cultural expectations and background, then that's the place where if I make that implicit judgment about what looks like participation or what looks like that sort of thing, then I'm imposing that, and that's prone to bias. So taking yourself out of that loop. So, for example, we interviewed some instructors for our book where one of the things they did is they collaboratively created a rubric for participation along with their students. And so the students' voices were part of that and included things that you might not have noticed otherwise. And another example of that is having students self-assess on participation. And I know some people have a reaction to the idea of students self-assessing, but my experience has been that if you actually give students space to do it and sort of help them structure their thinking, they're remarkably honest about their own actual learning, their own actual participation. And it's pretty amazing what they will tell you.
Robert, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, to that last point David just made, if anything, many students are a little too harsh on themselves. I've had this situation where I've had students self-grade some or even all of their work in a class, and they are their own worst graders in some ways. I mean, especially women and minoritized students in the STEM disciplines will have sort of a stereotype threat going on where like somehow an ingrown held belief that they have to work harder or they're being held to a higher standard because they represent a certain demographic. And it's really, I'm just looking at their work. I'm trying to, at least. Like David said, it's a sort of an asymptotic thing. I mean, you have to pay attention to your students and listen to what they say because you don't know what you don't know, just like you said, Steve. But you might think that if you ask students to self-assess on things like participation or even like the quality of their coursework in general, that they would just give themselves A's every time, because isn't that the instrumental way of approaching things? But in fact, I've had to raise students' grades on these things to say like, no, what you did was fine. It was really good, in fact, and you should give yourself more credit for this. And it's empowering, but it's also difficult for students because I think they are used to thinking of themselves as inferior products to the professor that's teaching them. And that's why they judge themselves so harshly.
This connects directly to the whole trust topic, right? I mean, you need to trust your students, and also you need to help your students trust that you actually have their best interests at heart. And when they do, they're willing to be a little more vulnerable like that, to say, what they really believe about their learning.
This must be very challenging for these minoritized and historically excluded students. It's a huge change in the way they're being treated in a course. Does it have a big impact? Do you see that? Do you see that in student reflections? Do you notice that? Do I notice?
I guess what I notice is that it takes some time for students to get into the habit of trusting authority figures in a school. And this is a really sad commentary on where we are today. I mean, especially considering that the entire concept of education is predicated on trust. I mean, I'm trusting students, and we see this now with discussions about chatbots and AI. I mean, I'm trusting students to really be turning in their own thoughts, and they are trusting me to not screw them over and to know what I'm talking about and to have some comprehensive knowledge of the subject. And if that ever breaks down, then there's no point to doing this whole enterprise that we're doing here. And yet, it's hard to learn how to trust when you have been institutionally trained to distrust. And that's just true across the board. I think students want to be in a different place in terms of the relationship that they have with their professors. And so do professors. I mean, I think by and large, most professors may put off sort of a tough guy image. Oh, I'm super rigorous, and these students had better get in line with my grading, or I'm going to give them all Fs or whatever. It's a recent article on Inside Higher Ed that was just shockingly cynical and awful. The premise of this article was, we're not giving enough Fs in higher education. If we just gave more Fs, people would magically be better students or something. I don't know. It was all just sad. It was just like, who hurt you? That's what I was thinking with this author.
Yeah.
We all want better than this. And I think one of the things that David and I are finding as we talk about our book and as we write the blog is that there's a great hunger out there for something better than what we already have. I mean, I think the professoriate academia is just ready for a more healthy relationship between professoriate students and this whole business of work that we do together.
So both of you, this is a question. Did both of you, when you started your careers, did you start by giving grades in a traditional manner?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was the hardest of the tough guys. I mean, I was one of those people back when I started that took pride in how many Fs I gave. I mean, like, oh, I got these students dead to rights. They're gonna find out who's boss around here, and that was the way I operated for several years, for a decade or more. I just found that what really was at the bottom of that, I was just really deeply unhappy with what I was doing, and so I was taking it out on my students. It was kind of a form of distrust of myself.
So now that you are using alternative forms of grading, and based on your blog and our discussions, it's an iterative process, right? You're constantly, we'll talk about your New Year resolutions, right? It's iterative. You're always working to improve it, because we know perfection is, as you said, it's asymptotic. We'll never get there, right? So there's always work to be done.
I want to interject for a moment and say,
sure.
So we're talking about a lot of ideas here, a lot of big picture ideas. And I think it's really important to say that it is an iterative process. Robert and I have both been iterating and continue to iterate for a lot of years. And people listening to this should absolutely know, like, you do not need to jump in feet first, change everything all at once, or else you're a bad person or something. Like, not at all, right? It is an iterative process that you can start small, build to where you can in your context.
Absolutely right.
All right. So anecdotal, because I'm going to ask out your personal experiences. How has your relationships with your students changed since implementing alternative grading methods?
I feel like there's a chicken or the egg problem here. I definitely feel like I have much more trusting, less antagonistic relationships with my students. But there's a good question about, did I start using alternative grading partly because I wanted that? Is that happening partly because I have been using alternative grading? And I think the answer is both. There's a feedback loop going on there that's sort of reinforcing how I'm thinking about students and why I'm doing what I'm doing. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, I was just about to say the exact same thing as David did. It was definitely sort of a positive feedback loop where I don't know. I was in Grand Valley is not my first academic position, and I was in a couple of colleges before I came to GVSU in 2011. Previous college I was in, it was not going well. I had a very highly antagonistic relationship between students and myself and the administration. It just wasn't a good scene. And when I came to Grand Valley, I was deliberately trying to reset everything. One of the things I remember, I was not doing anything like alternative grading. I didn't even know what there was else besides traditional grading at that point. But I remember coming to Grand Valley, and what struck me about where we work is that the professors work with students, not against students. And that was just like revelatory to me. And that kind of drove me toward, I was like, I want more of that, because I got a taste of it. I was like, this is what I'm after. This is what makes like my work worth waking up for and coming in for. And I wanted more of that. And it seemed like specifications grading at the time that I discovered it was kind of, that was in the right general direction I was hoping to go, and getting in that direction drives me further in that direction. And so it reinforces itself. But like David said, it's small stuff at first. It's general concepts at first, I would say. It's not even like stuff. It's just kind of having the mindset of, my students aren't customers. They're more like clients, right? I'm working with them to co-create something.
Right.
An interesting thing that I discovered very early on when I was first using, in my case, it'd be called standards-based grading, really early on. When I was first using it, it was really all about me. Like, I wanted to use it because it would better represent in my grade book what students learned, and I could use that to improve my teaching, and I could use it to better give the right grade. But it was really all about, like, I wanted that data. But just by using that system and having clear standards and allowing multiple opportunities to meet those standards, I discovered that how students interacted with me and also with their learning changed a lot. So, for example, office hours turned way better because it wasn't a student coming in, why is this 7 out of 10 instead of 8 out of 10? Can I please have that point back? Because everything was phrased in terms of like a specific learning target, and it was you got it or you didn't. And so the questions became things like, I'm working on this specific topic, right? It was about the content, and I'm not making it, right? I'm not earning the S's or whatever, or, whatever letter we use to represent it. And like the conversation just got so much better. It was about the math. It was about them learning, and it wasn't antagonistic and I'm the one controlling and they are the ones having to figure out what I want. I realized that, and I liked that about the system. And so then in future iterations, I started to intentionally build that in more. And so that's sort of the positive feedback loop Robert's talking about for me is, now I want to make that happen. And now I see it works. And so I'm going to do it a slightly better way next time.
Right. So, so there's a positive feedback loop. Once your students trust you and you trust them, and you sort of start building relationships, and you realize you want more of that, and it drives you in this direction, it sounds like. One of the things that I just want to make sure we say, because I don't think we said it explicitly, is that essentially all the work your students are doing in your courses is formative work. They're working on learning. They're working on developing expertise. You have moments where they get grades, but even at those moments, it appears as though they can always rework that exam and fix their mistakes and learn from it and move forward. Is that true generally?
Well, there are limitations on the amount of feedback that a professor can possibly manage in a semester. Like for example, in my current class in differential equations, we have these 11 foundational skills. They're like basic skills I want students to really master, and they do it by doing weekly quizzes on these we do in class. And students get 3 attempts at it.
3 attempts.
Okay, they can do it 1 week, and then they can do a new version of it the next week, and then they can do a version the next week, and then it's retired. And we're going to have one last chance quiz at the very end if you need one more shot. But it's not like unlimited. We emphasize reattempts without penalty. Like we don't penalize students for reattempting it, but it's not revisions or reattempts without boundaries, right? Because we're human beings. We have 168 hours in a week, and that's never going to change. And, you're not your best self when you're constantly grading things, honestly. So there are some limitations. I think those limitations create a little bit of urgency and creativity in students, and they learn how to get things done. They realize this isn't just a free for all. They do have to sort of get things done within boundaries. But like you say, there's the realization that when I take a quiz, this is not the only time I will ever have this quiz.
Right.
Unless I choose it to be the only time I ever have this quiz.
Right.
But it is true, the boundary between formative and summative or evaluation does definitely get blurred, right? That there's, generally speaking, whatever is done, there usually is another chance, or it's known that this is not necessarily the final stop on the road to learning. And it's definitely a different way of thinking about what this assessment means. Students can take it either way. Some students really buy into that idea, but then can take it too far, like, oh, well, I don't really have to try this time. And so you may have to readjust their expectations. And others are so used to a traditional system that they don't. Like, this was it. I failed on this one. I'm stuck. And you have to adjust their expectations as well. So different people react in different ways.
Interesting. Right. So potentially what might be a summative moment for students can still be a learning moment, because for traditional graders, a summative moment is it. When you've taken the test, that's it. You can't fix it. You can't repair it. You might get something wrong, and you're unlikely to learn from that mistake. You're going to throw it away. You're going to throw it in the trash and move on. Versus for you, a summative moment where they might have an opportunity to fix something can still be a learning moment. I studied. I know this was important. I did my best. I missed that one thing. Oh, let's go back and learn it because I can redo that problem and get credit for it, and I won't be penalized. I don't know if it's groundbreaking. I mean, for students, it's earth-shattering, right?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the boundary between formative and summative is up to the student. I mean, the student decides when they're done. It's groundbreaking for students, but that's the only place where it is groundbreaking. I mean, every other sphere of human life, like I'm a musician, and if I'm learning a song, whether I've learned the song is up to me.
Mm-hmm.
And what's good enough? I mean, for sometimes it's like, it's okay, it's good enough. But maybe I want to really nail it, and it's not good enough. So I put the work together, and I decide when it's done. That's true for whether you're a musician or an architect or anything, like, with a few exceptions. The person who is doing the work decides when they're done. Ultimately, it's up to the human being to make that choice. And this is kind of where what we're doing is we're giving that choice back to students in collaboration with us as co-creators.
Right. This conversation is happening on January 18th, 2023. I thought we could spend a few minutes talking about your New Year resolution blogs, posts, articles that each one of you have written. David, you want to simplify. You want to expand on that?
Yeah, specifically, I want to simplify.
He wants to double simplify.
Really simplify. Yeah. We kind of touched on this earlier that it's possible to make super complicated grading systems, traditional or alternative. And for some reason, I think both Robert and I began on the super complicated end of it. And ever since then, I've been working to make this system simpler and easier to communicate and to more just get out of the way. There's a temptation that I feel, and I know a lot of people do, to try to, like, oh, once you've decided I'm going to totally change my grading system, well, I can make a perfect grading system that exactly represents what students know and has all the details. No, I mean, that is never possible. That just makes things more complicated. So one of the things I've really been aiming on is to streamline my system, to remove special cases, to remove things that students really get hitched up on that don't seem to help with the learning and are just like rules I put in place because I thought that was going to somehow make things better, and it didn't. So a simpler system, fewer standards to assess, making a clear separation of what it is I'm assessing at any given moment, as opposed to having a whole bunch of things all mixed up together. And when I want to assess whether students can put all the ideas together, to make that an explicit moment as well. So sort of making very clearly stated what it is I'm doing at any point and removing all of the special cases and extra cruft that gets added on.
Okay, cruft I'm going to have to look up. That's a word I don't know. Cruft.
Robert can confirm or deny. I think that's a computer science-y term, cruft that gets added into a program. So.
Yeah, I think I think it's adopted from CS. We're referring to like unnecessary code in a piece of software, cruft.
Okay.
That crufts up your code. It's both a noun and a verb.
Okay, good. I wonder if they'll allow that on Spelling Bee. I will try that tomorrow on Spelling Bee next time I get the chance. fewer standards. You mentioned fewer standards.
Mm-hmm.
So people are going to wonder what's happening to content. Are you having to cut content? What are you doing in terms of how does that impact content?
I'm still assessing all the same things I ever did, but how I assess them is changing.
Okay.
So here's maybe I would call the key streamline that's happening. I have content standards that are assessed on quizzes. And so these are fairly direct things, right? These are low levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Do you know exactly how to do this, how to state this definition, how to make this computation happen? Those are content standards. But in the class I'm thinking of for this, as in most classes, I want students to be able to put those things together, right? To do more complex, higher level Bloom's tasks. And I used to try to weave those standards into those tasks as well. So what I was really doing was I was sometimes assessing the standards at a really high level and sometimes at a low level, and it was nonetheless all the same standards. And so what I've done instead is use a different approach. When I want everything brought together, I grade that holistically with what would be called specifications grading. So, holistically, are you able to put all of these things together in a way that I can describe? And so when I say reducing the standards, I mean being really careful about which things do I want to assess at this lower Bloom's level, and then which things do I want to assess at this higher Bloom's level where I'm not going to use standards. I'm going to do it holistically instead.
Right. I'll put a link on the website about Bloom's taxonomy so people who are less familiar can find out about that, but we won't describe that right now. Robert, you admittedly stole from David on your New Year's resolution or copied or something because you said simplify also.
I'll admit it. I steal from David all the time, and he steals from me too. So, I mean, it's all good.
He simplified it.
Let's not talk about your simplifications there. One of the things you also said that you want to do is show more empathy to your students. Let's take a minute for that.
Well, I've just been thinking a lot about emotional intelligence in general. In addition to my role as a professor, I also work in the president's office at my university. And so I've been doing a lot of leadership training this past year in this particular role. And emotional intelligence keeps coming up as a key leadership trait. And the more I look at really great leaders in higher ed and also really poor leaders in higher ed, I see the difference that emotional intelligence can make. And empathy is a super important component to emotional intelligence. And looking back on my own grading practices, I can definitely see times where I don't necessarily remember that my students are human beings in a stage of development, that you can't expect them to have it all figured out or have their stuff together at any given moment. I certainly didn't have it all together when I was 18, 19, 20 years old. And so just kind of when you're grading and evaluating work, just kind of remember the context. In academics, we're always thinking about the nuances in the context, and that should go for our students as well. I mean, I'm thinking about students who go directly from my class at 4 p.m. when it ends to a job that goes until midnight. Mm-hmm. And so this has a direct impact on how they can engage with what I'm asking them to do in the course. And I just need to keep this in mind. Or we talked a little earlier about just the psychological difficulty it can take to learn to trust a professor. I mean, if you ask students about their math experiences in the past, I can guarantee you that a large percentage of them are going to be traumatized by math experiences in the past. I mean, no lie. I don't like throwing out that word trauma all the time, but it really does rise to the real definition of trauma at this point. And it's hard. And it's hard to remember that it's hard for other people. You know, when we're the survivors, right? We survived all this substandard pedagogy and bizarre traditional grading practices in the past. And so it's real easy for myself or David to step back and say, like, well, what's the matter with you? You know, you should just get in line and get up to our standards because we're the ones with the knowledge. But in fact, you know, if we're really thinking of students as co-creators, they're trying to build something that is going to be of value to them. We're trying to help them build something of value. And we should probably take each other's situation into account. And that's just what I the more I look at my own daily practice, my daily walk, the more I realize I kind of need more of that everywhere. If I'm being really honest about myself and just laying it all out there on your podcast, all my dirty laundry, this is an area of growth, an opportunity for growth for me. Since we're talking about growth, is to just keep the student in mind, the actual individual student in mind when you are grading them.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. It's getting late here. I'd like to end our conversation. I got 3 questions to end with. They shouldn't take too long. According to my eldest daughter, psychologists refer to this as the miracle question. So, concerning student success, if you could wave your magic wand and have every faculty member do one thing, what would that be? If you could wave your wand and change faculty behavior, but just one thing.
Believe that their students are really trying their best. Believe and act on it.
So a mindset issue. Believe in your students, which is great. Robert, you can't copy and steal.
I'm not going to copy, but some of this may sound real similar because Dave and I, there's a reason that we're co-authors on a book together. We're kind of simpatico. A great colleague of mine once said that most student-centered pedagogy can be summarized by the phrase "get over yourself." And so, if I were going to be kind of in your face about it on the nose, I would say I would really wish that we collectively as a faculty could just get over ourselves. Stop making it about us and what's comfortable for us and what worked for us. Whenever you hear people talk about pedagogy or grading practice or anything that is not centered on students and not centered on research, you will hear the first person pronoun show up a lot. Like, I did it this way. It worked for me. We did it this way when I was in graduate school. It's all me, 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 me. And I really kind of wish, if not simply get over yourself, to hold up a mirror to the language that you use and just see how much of that reference goes to you and how much are you actually referring to the students that you're teaching. I don't know if that's a single thing that I wish for, but I do wish for it nonetheless.
No, I like that. I think that's great. I think those are great. To get faculty to really believe in their students. They all have the capacity to succeed.
And I think that a lot of what we're talking about here, it's easy to get lost in the details and the weeds of how you implement, alternative grading or anything like that. And there's so many ways to do it, but the individual way that works for a faculty member is going to grow out of what they believe about students and their learning.
Right. And really, we haven't spent our time talking about details of how you do alternative grading. That's not what we've talked about today. It's a mindset. It's choices. It's how you see your students, how you see yourself. That's good. All right. So that was one question. Next question. All right. Your work on alternative grading is wonderful. It's great for your students. And you're really trying to link grades to student learning and student progress. That seems to be really the ultimate goal, is to really have grades reflect how students have progressed in your course. So can you take a moment to talk about why this particular issue became so important to you? Was there a transformational moment that drove you to this issue? Was there an interaction with a student that happened? What was it that made this? You both went from traditional grading systems to not. When you think about this, is there a story that pops in your head that you like to talk about or don't ever talk about? I have had somebody share a story once that they've never told. Robert, why don't we start with you?
I think about this almost every day. And I wrote about this on the blog real early. So I was teaching calculus a few years ago before I had any notion of alternative anything in the grading sphere. And I had a student in the class who was not a math major, I think biology, I want to say, but she loved math, like really loved math, and was super excited, like a leader in the class, helping other people learn too in her group. Better teacher than I was, honestly. But she was on about a 7 to 8 day delay in understanding concepts from everybody else in the class. She just needed just a little more time than anybody else. And of course, in a traditionally graded class, it happens on my schedule. It happens when I say it happens. And so, gradually, after the first test, and it was one of these 3 tests and a final type of situation. And after the first test, she had been mathematically eliminated from an A in the class because she had like a 20% on it. Second test, mathematically eliminated from a B. She didn't make it to the third test. By that point, she had grown belligerent in class, like blurting out like these. It's like, I don't understand why we're learning this, and just very upset, and became clinically depressed, dropped the class, and I never saw her again. And it was all because of my grading system. And I finished that semester thinking, like, I don't know what else is out there, but I cannot continue in good conscience to ethically grade the way that everybody else has been grading since apparently forever. And so I had already made my syllabi up for the next semester. This was the end of a fall semester. We got Christmas break and then we go into the next. So I'd already made my class up, and I took the syllabus and I just deleted it. And so I'm going to start over with something. I'm probably going to have to create the whole system from scratch because I don't know what else is out there. But it can't be this. Never again am I going to use this kind of grading, period. I am never going to let another situation like that student happen to me ever again in my career. I would quit before it happened. And then it just so happened that my great friend and mentor, Linda Nilsson, dropped this book called Specifications Grading, Restoring Rigor and Saving Faculty Time. This was back around 2017, 2016, I want to say. I'd worked with Linda back when I was a graduate student, and she was the Center for Teaching Director at Vanderbilt. She's been appearing at key moments throughout my career to kind of just give me a boost when I need it. She's actually going to be writing the foreword to our book too. And I read that book in like 3 days, and I put together a system along the lines of her book. And it wasn't good. It was super overcomplicated, and I bit off way more than I could chew. But it was better than anything else I'd ever done up to that point. And so that's my story anyway. It all comes down to one student that just kind of put me over the edge.
That was some time ago. Have you ever reached out to that student and found?
I've never seen that person again. I suppose I could go look them up, but yeah, never again. I've never heard that person again. I'd love to know how they're doing. I hope they're okay.
Okay, so challenge. I think you should reach out.
I think I may do that.
Then I want to hear about it. Then you got to come back and talk to me about it.
Right. That would be something.
Then we can share stories. Interesting. David, your turn.
Yeah. I'm going to give a different sort of answer from a different point of view, because I was thinking about this recently. When I was in my very first semester of college, all math majors had to take this one class, and it was just a weird looking thing. What is this? That class was taught by this one instructor where, like, everything he did, you would call it alternative grading, alternative teaching methods. Just everything in it was way out there. What he did was he demonstrated how to run a really student-centered class. Everything was very inquiry-based. It was very conversational. It was really focused on our learning. The assessments were sort of the same type, right? It was a pretty small class, talking with students. There were no letter grades. There were no points anywhere. It was just totally out of left field and totally unlike any other class I was having that semester, or pretty much any other semester. And the key thing for me was it showed me that was even possible, right? It was sort of one of these, I didn't actually realize that this was even a thing, that there was this world over here. You know, I could tell you stories about, like, the first time I learned about standards-based grading or whatever, but I think a lot of it goes right back to somebody demonstrated what was possible, and that allowed me to then consider that for myself when I became a professor. And I think that's incredibly important, and it's definitely part of the work that Robert and I are doing with this book and related things, is if you don't know what's possible, then you're not going to do it.
Sorry, when was this for you?
My very first semester as an undergrad, so it caught me early.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you'd been trained to sit and listen and, be a good student, and you knew how to learn. And you come in and then somebody breaks the system and does it totally differently.
And it was a good experience, right? It was well done. And so it wasn't that I had this and said, I'm never going to touch that. It was, that was amazing. And I want to recreate that in my own classes in the future.
And did you know you wanted to teach by that point?
Actually, no, I had no idea that I wanted to teach, and I was pretty sure I didn't want to. And that changed a lot once I ended up in grad school. And grad students end up in classrooms, often without a lot of freedom. And as a lot of people do, I discovered that I liked it, and also that I wanted to do things in a way that I thought was better for students.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so last question. How has this lens of learning and assessment, right, because that's what you're doing, students are learning and you're assessing, how's that impacted you outside of the academy when you're living your life outside of the university, not dealing with students? You're going to the movie, you're going to a restaurant, you're with your spouse, your kids, whatever, you're at a park, you're on vacation, if anybody does that anymore. How does this lens impact how you view and interact with the rest of the universe? Robert, you put your finger up, so.
Well, I want to jump in on this because I've got 3 teenage kids. I have a 14, a 17, and 19-year-old, and 2 of them are in school right now. And I'm famous around here for telling them that they shouldn't worry about their grades. It's like, the college professor, and the person telling them to like chill out if you earned something or other on your test. And I'm also the person known to go into the parent teacher conferences and ask some pretty pointed questions about what it is they think they're doing with the grades in their classes. Our school system
they must love you.
Uses standards-based grading, which is a form of alternative grading, up until the 4th grade, and it's wonderful. And then they switch it when they get into intermediate school, and it's horrible. So when I work with my kids, and my 17-year-old brings her geometry homework into my home office here, and we're working together, I'm just saying like, oh, it's okay. You might get a bad grade, but for now, but then you will have more chances to do this, even though they're not actually doing alternative grading in her school. Unfortunately, I want to get her out of this mindset that grades should define who she is. And I think that's a readily acceptable message to most teenagers if you can just get them to believe it. And I think it's made her a better person, to be honest. And also as a musician, I've just been really tuned into the idea about feedback loops. And the more I do iteration and feedback in my classes, the more I realize that when I am sort of grading myself, practicing, my instrument, it's all about the feedback. And I have to give myself good feedback and know how to act upon it. It goes both ways too. I've been a musician for a lot longer than I've been a mathematician. And so I'm noticing that a lot of what I do in the classroom, that's my musician brain leaking into my classroom practice. The way that I handle assessments is very similar to the way I would handle a band rehearsal, for instance. And so it kind of cuts both ways. I mean, I think it impacts what I do outside of the classroom, but also the impact kind of reverberates back into the classroom, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. David, what about you? How's it?
I'm actually going to piggyback on one of Robert's New Year's resolutions. So I think being a teacher and just someone who thinks about teaching and students a lot has helped make me a more empathetic person. And I think that using alternative grading and thinking a lot about how students learn has only accelerated that, right? And that very much applies to any sort of interactions I have outside of the classroom as well. Just developing my own understanding of what it is that people do and how they act and what they could possibly be thinking. And the fact that I think if you had asked me 15 years ago, I would probably have said people are generally trying to get away with things. And nowadays I would say, I believe most people are doing their best. Not just my students, but like anyone I meet in my everyday life. They are doing their best, and I need to approach any interaction with that in mind. And so teaching and learning has really helped me develop as a person in that way.
Nice. That's great. These last few years have been super challenging in those ways. That's a great thing to bring to the table. It's good. Robert, David, I would like to thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I encourage everyone to read your blog, Grading for Growth, which can be found at gradingforgrowth.com. Also, the book is coming out sometime this year. Do we have a publication date?
It's good. April, May-ish. We don't have a date yet, but we're in the copy editing stage right now. So I feel like we're in the home stretch.
Spring, early summer, something like that?
Yeah. Okay.
So people should start looking out for it. For more information about Dr. Clark and Dr. Talbert, please go to our website, teachingforstudentsuccess.org. Thank you for spending time with us today. Please share our podcast and website with your friends, colleagues, and administrators. We love hearing from our listeners. Please contact us through our website. If an episode has impacted your teaching, and we certainly hope this one does, please send us a note and tell us your story. Teaching for Student Success is a production of Teaching for Student Success Media. Now I'm going to interject here, and you're going to be the second person, Robert, that I've asked this. If you're a musician and you'd like to make some music for the podcast, we'd be happy to play it here.
Absolutely. I got all my recording gear set up right in front of this microphone right now.
Sure. If you want an intro, I need intro and outro music. I've been using some vibes that I found on Pixabay. So at the end of this podcast, we'll be listening to music of Julius H. His music can be found on Pixabay, and I love it. But if you'd like to compose something for the podcast, I'd love to use it.
You know what? I'll give it a shot.
Excellent. Anyway, thank you both. Really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.